Well, up next, we're diving into a topic that's a top of mind for a lot of farmers. You have pesticide regulation and what are its impacts on farming practices. Joining us is one of the absolute foremost experts on that topic in the entire country. Dr. Aaron Hager is a professor of weed sciences right here at the University of Illinois. And Brigit Rollins will also be joining us, and she is the staff attorney at the National Agricultural Law Center. Together, they'll provide an in-depth overview of the policy implications surrounding the Environmental Protection Agency's herbicide strategy and share practical agronomic strategies that Illinois farmers can adopt to navigate these proposed regulations. Following their presentation, there will be a Q&A session, so please join us in welcoming Dr. Hager and Brigit Rollins.
Well, good morning. That was about as weak as it was last Sunday morning. Try it again. Good morning. Good morning. Now we can go. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And by the way, I'm not Bill Chisholm. And you might be asking yourself, who the hell is Bill Chisholm? And I will be happy to tell you. Bill Chisholm worked for the U.S. EPA for a little more than 20 some odd years. And while he was with the agency, we started talking about this idea of these strategies, the Endangered Species Act. And I know he was on a webinar one time, and I posed a question to him. And the answer he gave was just kind of shallow. And I was a little surprised with it. Well, not too long after that, Bill retired from US EPA. And he actually became what we have in our Weed Science Society of America, which, yeah, there are a lot of other people just somewhat like me in the world. It doesn't make you feel very comfortable, I get it. He became chair of the Weed Science Society of America Committee on the Endangered Species Act. And so I had Bill talk to a group of Extension Weeds folks a couple of years ago. And one of the first things that Bill said is about the strategies that were being proposed by the agency at that time went something like this. We got a problem. So I asked Bill to speak to our group, as you can see here on the slide, last September, of our Extension Weed Science group, and I'll show you toward the end, Bill is much more optimistic. But really, to summarize everything in a very succinct way is on this slide right here, and that is that herbicide labels, and actually all pesticide labels, or at least all herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, and rodenticide labels, will be changing in the future. And let me ask this other question. Anybody in here use Enlist soybean or Enlist 1 or Enlist Duo? Okay. Which of the label mandated runoff mitigation practices did you implement to get either 4 or 6 runoff mitigation points? That's one question in 32 years that I've never got an answer for. So this is actually something that we've actually had somewhat in existence for the last 4 to 5 years after those product labels were re-registered by US EPA. But to take a step back, I guess why are we doing this, and what is the Endangered Species Act? Well, this was an act passed by Congress back in 1973. And obviously the purpose of this act is to protect federally listed threatened or endangered species. Now, one of the key features of this is not only do you have to protect the species, you have to protect the critical habitat, or that area, or that food supply, or that water resource that these endangered species need to survive. Most of these that we have in Illinois, and I think we have like 32 or 33 listed endangered species here in Illinois, they're not in our soybean fields, they're not growing in our corn fields, but they maybe have a habitat that's a mile downstream from one of our fields. So that's really the key focus on this. It requires any federal agency, so this is not just about the US EPA, right? This is the Department of Transportation, this is the Defense Department, for example. So any action that agency takes has to be ensured that it will not adversely impact one of our endangered species. Now, what does that have to do with EPA? Obviously, EPA registers pesticides, and that is a federal action. So the agencies, now ESA is not enforced by US EPA. ESA is actually within 2 other agencies, the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries. Those are what we collectively refer to as the services. So they have the statutory responsibility for the ESA. And these are the agencies that look at a proposed action and offer some kind of a biological opinion on whether or not that action could jeopardize an endangered species. And if it will, then that agency who proposed that action has to modify it. So specifically the roles here for EPA, Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries, and USDA. Of course, EPA is the agency that registers pesticides, and in particular, the Office of Pesticide Programs. And essentially what EPA works under, so to speak, from a statutory standpoint is what's called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or what we abbreviate as FIFRA. FIFRA is very different from ESA in a lot of context. And one in particular is that FIFRA basically says thou shalt not do anything that adversely affects the environment, considering the risks and benefits of that action. So what does that mean? Well, in other words, let's just say a company has a new pesticide that they want to register. Maybe that particular pesticide is not tightly adsorbed by soil. It could potentially leach through the soil profile, okay? That would be considered as a risk. But when the EPA also considers the benefits of that action, okay? Lynn really needs new herbicide on his farm, so we need to really register this because of the problems that he's encountering because of X, Y, or Z weed problem. If the benefits in the analysis outweigh the risks, the agency can go ahead with that registration. ESA basically is a thou shalt not do anything to adversely impact endangered species. So really there is no risk-benefit analysis when it comes to the ESA provisions. Fish and Wildlife, that's the agency responsible for the terrestrial species. National Marine Fisheries Service, those are in charge of the aquatic species. And in the role of USDA, they'll do a lot of assessments on what some of these proposals, what these proposed actions will do. They'll evaluate potential impacts. They'll talk about mitigations. Obviously, with NRCS, that agency is going to become more and more involved in some of these runoff mitigation practices. And so if ESA has been in existence since 1973, why are we talking about it now? Why after 50 some odd years? Why did I start giving these presentations 2.5 years ago when we never really talked about this before? And I guess the easy answer is because of lawsuits. US EPA cannot defend its actions in court because they had not followed the provisions and their statutory requirements under the Endangered Species Act. So organizations like the Center for Biological Diversity will take the US EPA to court over a registration action that does not follow ESA, and they win. So, and I hope Brigit will touch on this, I'm not exactly sure when this mega suit was actually filed, but it was one that was jeopardizing or potentially impacting over 1,000 different pesticide registrations. That's not good. How would you farm today if you would lose that many pesticide options, okay? And so when the agency settled this suit in court, they agreed to do a few things. And one is to speed up the process of these evaluations in terms of consulting with the services for their endangered species consultations. So biological evaluations, that may be where the agency determines whether or not there could be an adverse effect to a listed species. The strategies, and we'll talk specifically about the herbicide strategy here just a little bit because we do have that in place now. The final strategy has been released and is in place. And what's called the Vulnerable Species Project, and that's the one that worries me still. I think we're going to be okay with the herbicide strategy. I think we'll be all right with the insecticide and fungicide strategies, but the vulnerable species one, that's still got me a little bit nervous on where they're going to go with this. So when is all this going to take place? Well, the agency, when they released the strategy, said these are not self-implementing. So essentially what that means is that not every herbicide label will have ESA provisions here in the 2025 growing season. When these provisions will come into play is that if we have a new registration, and we'll look at an example of one that just happened, I think, last November or December, that will go through the ESA consultation, or when pesticides have to be re-evaluated, re-registered once every 15 years. So existing active ingredients, when they go through the re-registration process, that's when they will come under the ESA consultations and provisions. So essentially 15 years from now, all herbicide labels will have some kind of an ESA provision on them. So we talked about the herbicide strategy, or we will here in just a moment, but again, these will cover insecticides, these will cover fungicides, and these will cover rodenticides. I think the good news in these strategies, and trust me, there will be some differences among these strategies, but I think the similarities among the strategies are going to be more common than the differences. So some of the mitigations that we'll use for herbicides, for example, are likely to be some of the very same mitigations that we'll have for fungicides and insecticides. Now, been asked this question quite a bit. Is this going to go away with the change of administrations? My answer is this: I hope not. Because to get you new pesticides, the EPA has to do something to be in compliance with ESA. Otherwise, it'll all go back into the court system again. and EPA will lose. So the state lead agencies will be the ones that are charged with the enforcement of the provisions of these Endangered Species Act. They don't really know yet how they're going to do this. Last conversation I had with Springfield Department of Ag folks, they weren't really sure how they were going to handle this. Will it go away? And the answer is unlikely. I think the strategies have been put forth that have a lot of flexibility in them. I think they've been built that they could be modified in the future if new technology comes into the marketplace that could be further advantageous to reduce off-target movement. Will the ESA itself go away? And the answer is that's probably one of those political hot potatoes in D.C. that probably neither party wants to even touch. And quite frankly, it's been very successful in the preservation of species for a lot of other government agencies. And so if we think this is going to be a burdensome thing, and it'll be something new, something that we haven't really done a whole lot before, because you just confessed you haven't done anything with the Enlist products yet. There's basically, sorry, Ron. There's about 3 options moving forward. One is the courts can remove the pesticide registrations. We saw that about a year ago when the Arizona court decision vacated the labels of the dicamba products that we use in soybeans. Option number 2 is that could restrict where these products are used based geographically on the location of some of these endangered species. Okay? Or the third would be come up with these mitigations to protect the species. And I don't think anybody in the room would say that reducing the likelihood of off-target herbicide or insecticide or fungicide movement from a target area is a bad thing. That's really a good thing. Okay? So fortunately, I think with option 3, it's going to be a doable thing for us. Now, here's a map of every county of the United States. The darker the blue, the more intense or the higher the frequency of endangered species in that particular area. According to the map, every county in the United States has at least 1 endangered species. If you're more concerned about Illinois, here's our distribution. Okay? We're here in Champaign County this morning. We have 10 endangered species listed in this county. The fewest I think I counted on here were 6. The most was 19. So of those, I think, again, we have about 32 different species here in the state of Illinois. Now, these can change over time, and they have changed over time. We have birds, clams, crustaceans, fish, plants, insects, mammals, reptiles, and snails. Okay. We have a lot of diversity. So for each one of these species now, for further action of the agency on pesticide registration, they have to take these into consideration. So the herbicide strategy itself, we are being targeted intentionally, and they make no bones about that. We are targeting agriculture because who is the largest user of pesticides, and that would be us. So large volumes, and they actually decided to do herbicides first because of all the pesticides. We have the largest volume of pesticide use in herbicides. So we'll target cultivated land, row crops, specialty crops, etc. The areas in blue at the bottom of the slide are not covered, at least not yet, by the strategy. So anything for aquatics, pastures, roadsides, rights-of-ways, rangelands, and thank goodness golf courses aren't covered. I didn't have any say in that one. And again, so the focus of what these strategies are going to do is obviously to protect the species and, again, the critical habitat of those species. And the way they're going to do this is they will target the areas of spray drift, so actual drift during the application itself, runoff, and erosion. Okay, so those are going to be the 2 big areas. The other one would be what's called a PULA, a pesticide use limitation area. Now, how many of you actually use some of the dicamba products in soybean after 2018? You know what a PULA is because you had to go to a website called Bulletins Live 2 to see whether or not that you're making that wherever you're making that application, if there's additional restrictions on that application. Anybody remember what those additional restrictions were? That downwind buffer increased from 220 to 330, and you had to put that 57-foot omnidirectional buffer on all other sides of the field. Okay? So that would be something that, I guess, technically at least, is not necessarily all new for us. So the required mitigations, okay? This is something that you're probably not going to like, but do not shoot the messenger, please. This applies to every field, not farming operation. Every field has to be considered. Now, that being said, mitigations will not be necessary on all fields. but we have to go through this exercise now at least once for every field, okay? Where do we find this information? Quite easily, it's going to be on the label. Okay, so you get some more practice reading product labels. That's just oodles and gobs of fun. Trust me, I've done that for 32 years. So that's the first place to look, okay? The labels will specify what the buffer is for a spray drift. It will specify how many mitigation points that you would need to reduce the runoff erosion potential. And it may, in many instances, direct you to look at the bulletins live too to see if there's any additional restrictions on that application based on the area where you're going to be making that application. It may also direct you to what's called the mitigation menu webpage. So if you want to use something like a grass waterway as one of your mitigation practices, you can go to the mitigation menu and find out how EPA defines what a grass waterway is, what the width of it has to be, how do you have to maintain it, etc. So let's go after the buffers first. So spray buffers are going to be on the downwind side of the field only. Anybody think of a challenge of that right now? How do you know what the downwind side is? When do you know what the downwind side is? The answer to that is when you pull into the field to make the application, okay? So that's why we're covering these things now that we have time before more labels have these requirements on here. You can go through this exercise, okay? You got a field and you can look at all downwind potential sides to see if there's some kind of an unmanaged area within 230 feet of it for a ground application. If there is, you may have to consider these buffers, okay? So the buffers, again, are to protect what the agency refers to as unmanaged areas. Those areas where there actually might be an endangered species or might actually be the critical habitat. So areas like fields, roads, mowed areas. Remember all those checklist items that you had on the dicamba product labels that could be included in that downwind buffer can be included here as well. Okay, so if you had a field and that particular 80 acres that you farm is surrounded on all sides by your neighbor's fields that are at least 230 feet wide, you're fine. You don't have to worry about this. Okay, so the buffers for ground applications go anywhere up to 230 feet, for aerial applications all the way up to 320 feet. There's also going to be some baseline mitigations that you'll start to see become fairly standardized on product labels, okay? There will be maximum wind speed restrictions on labels, and that's not necessarily a bad thing given the issues that we've had with off-target movement when we put things out in 30-mile-an-hour winds. Lots of tree issues still in the state, folks, and those are not going to go away. Things like temperature inversions, maximum release heights for either ground-based or aerial applications. So don't be surprised when these kinds of things become more standard. And again, these are just a list of things that can be included in those downwind managed areas. So again, something that's managed, you're fine. And in the first draft of the iteration of the herbicide strategy, I don't think CRP was listed as a managed area, and that was a problem. And NRCS did not like that at all, because that would probably curtail a lot of additional enrollment in CRPs. Now it is considered as a managed area, so that's a good thing. So here's an example. Say you got your sensitive area starts right at the water line, as you can see over here on the right side of that slide. And the label says that you have to leave a 50-foot downwind buffer, okay? But it just so happens that you have a windbreak at that edge that can be counted. You also have CRP that can be counted. So now you have 30 feet that can be counted toward that 50 foot. So instead of leaving 50 feet untreated in the field, now you're down to 20 feet. Okay, everybody see how that works? All right. The other good thing about the strategy, and folks, how many in the room have ever made a comment on a proposed strategy by the US EPA in an open comment period? I cannot stress to you how important that is to do that, because the first iteration of this strategy, the committee I told you about earlier that Bill Chisholm chairs, we're looking at this. We've gone through the exercise, and we as a state, we're in trouble because we could not meet the mitigation requirements. We are too flat as a state. What percent of Illinois farm ground has 3% or less slope? Anybody know? 53%. I looked it up. I was bored. So in the first iteration of the strategy, they said, well, if you got 3% or less slope, you get 1 point. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, help me understand why a flat field doesn't get more than 1 point. Didn't make any sense. But a lot of farm organizations, a lot of individuals, a lot of scientific societies made some very thoughtful comments during that comment period to the agency on that initial strategy, and it made a huge difference. This is an example of the difference that it made, okay? These are additional options. You now have 15 options that you can implement to further reduce that buffer distance. And you can start these right now, okay? If you had what they refer to as a high boom with fine droplets, you can reduce that by 55%. If all of a sudden now you went to a low boom and coarse droplets, you reduce that 75%, okay? And the nice thing about these mitigations, they're additive. So if you select two that are 55% each, you're done. So this is a very doable thing, okay? So just an example, you got a label that says you got a 200-foot downwind buffer. You got fine droplets and a low boom, that's 40%. You make an application when relative humidity is greater than 60, you just cut that buffer distance in half. And if you need to reduce it more, there's a lot of other options that you have, all right? So that's the buffers. That's the one part. That is very clear-cut in my mind, okay? Because the applicator, that's 100% the responsibility of the applicator. Okay, keeping something on site during that application has always been and will always be the responsibility of the applicator. This one now becomes a lot less clear in my mind, and hopefully Brigit will be able to clarify and get rid of my ignorance because I still have not got all this figured out. This is the runoff and the mitigation, okay? Now we talked about for ground applications up to 230 foot on the downwind side to an unmanaged area. For runoff mitigation, we're now up to 1,000 feet, okay? It's 1,000 feet on the downslope side of the field. How many of your fields only have one slope? Yeah, okay. So we had those other areas that could be included in that calculation. You've got the same ones right here. Okay, things like roads, gravels, fields, etc. Your 80-acre field, if it's surrounded on all sides by other farmed fields, other managed areas for a distance of 1,000 feet on the downslope side, you're fine. Okay? If not, then this may come into play. So this is going to be based on a point system, not a percent reduction like we had on the buffers. The most that you'll have is 9 points, 9 mitigation points. Now, similar to what the buffers were, you've got a lot of options. You got 40 different options that you could select from to try to reduce. Not all these are going to fit for us. We do not do a lot of contour farming in Illinois because we're flat. Okay? But there's a whole lot of other options. And again, a lot of these were not on the initial strategy. Now, I just want to show you something. This is just a list of possible mitigation points by various active ingredients. And the reason I'm showing this is that sometimes you will have different point requirements for the same active ingredient depending on where you apply it. So for an active ingredient that's used on a large number of acres for large acre crops, there's going to be more point required than if that same active ingredient is used in a crop that has much fewer acres. Okay, so it's kind of a volume issue. So, as I kind of alluded to and poked fun at, the flatness of our state, okay? EPA actually realized between the draft strategy and the final strategy that the models that they were using, and again, a lot of this is based on models, overestimated the runoff potential. So one thing that they came out with is what they call relief points. And relief points are based on your county. Okay, so for the 102 counties in Illinois, we have 2 that have 3 relief points. That'd be Piatt and Warren. We have 89 that have 2 relief points. And unfortunately, for some of the folks in the southern part of the state, we got 11 that have no relief points. Relief points you take right off the top. So you got an application that's going to require 6 runoff mitigation points, and you're doing that application in McLean County, you're down to 4. Okay, that's a good thing. And again, it's this 1,000 feet is the calculation to what could be considered an unmanaged area on the downslope side. EPA models that farther out than 1,000 feet, the effects of any runoff and mitigate or pesticide runoff is probably going to be minimal. Okay. Now, just a few other examples of some of these points that you can actually get. If you consult with an expert, And many times that would be somebody like a certified crop advisor on your strategy. You get a point for doing that. If you track your mitigations, and I'll show you a calculator here in just a minute, if you just track what you're doing, you get a point. If you use tactics from multiple groups of those 40, you get another point. So all of a sudden right now we've got probably 8 or 9 points and we haven't lifted a finger yet, okay? So these are different kinds of, I guess, broad categories where these points are at. You can reduce your rate, and I'm not a big fan of that, so please ignore the, please ignore the first set. I tried to point that out to EPA and they blew it right over. You know, area, field, soil, if you incorporate your pre-emergence herbicide, you get a point. Okay. Different types of farming practices, conservation practices. One thing, if you don't have overhead irrigation on the field, you get 3 points. Okay. I'm not going to go through all those, but there's a bunch of them because I really want to hear what Brigit has to say. More than one. I'm my least favorite speaker to listen to. But again, if you're not sure what some of these things are, you can look all those up on that mitigation menu. Okay. So here is the herbicide strategy basically. So you start off with the question basically, what does the label say? And do you need to go to Bulletin's Live 2? That's step number 2, okay? And then you go either to the left down in the yellow text, that's your runoff mitigations, or the rest of that in the center of the slide, that's buffers. So, Liberty Ultra, registered last, I think, November or December, has ESA provisions on the label. Okay, so if this product is used in the field in 2025, you're going to have to follow what the label now says. So question number 1, what mitigations are on the label? Does it have a Bulletin's Live 2 link? So in section 9 of the label, here's the spray drift mitigations. So for ground applications, you have a 10-foot downwind buffer. So be aware of that. 10 foot, you can reduce that down to 0 really easily, okay? Section 11 has mandated runoff mitigations. So you actually have 3 runoff mitigation points that you have to have. And then section 12 covers the endangered species of the Bulletin's Live 2. Now, the good news is, at least for Bulletin's Live 2, there are no PULAs for this product in the state of Illinois. So there will be no additional restrictions other than what's on the label now itself. Do you have runoff mitigation? The answer is yes. Okay. So again, on the downslope side, if you've got a sensitive area or an unmanaged area within 1,000 feet of the downslope edge of that field, you have to have 3 runoff mitigation points. Okay. Spray drift mitigation, some of these other things that are on the label. These are going to catch people off guard because a lot of times we haven't seen these things on labels before. You got a 24-inch boom height over the top of the canopy. Okay. You got a wind speed restriction. Actually, you got a range of wind speed. You have to apply this product when sustained winds, and it will define to you what a sustained wind is on the label, are between 3 and 15 miles an hour. You spray 16 miles an hour, you violated federal label. Okay. So, one of the very nice things that EPA did is come out with what they're calling the mitigation calculator. We have the one for runoff and erosion mitigations. They are working on one for spray drift mitigations. You can download this and you can do this right now. You do not have to wait. And what this is, basically, it's an Excel spreadsheet. So you look at this, here's the first page that you will open up when the file opens up. It tells you how to, what you need to do, how to use this calculator. And then when you go to the next tab, this is where you start filling in and making your selections. So if you enter in your state, we'll enter in Illinois. If you're in Champaign County, it's Champaign County. All of a sudden now you're going to see a 2 in that far right-hand column. That's the relief points. And what's nice about this calculator, it actually tabulates as you go through here and keeps track of how many runoff mitigation points you got. So we did this a couple of times, I think, for Champaign County and Livingston County, and I think we got to 11 points without too much difficulty. Okay. But there could be instances where that's going to be harder to do. Maybe you do need to implement one of those physical modifications to a field. Maybe you do have to put in a grass waterway somewhere. You've got time if you start doing this now before that becomes mandatory, if that's something that you need to do. Okay. So again, the PULAs, just one other thing I want to talk about just briefly on the PULAs. US EPA considers a PULA or Bulletin's Live 2 any additional restrictions that you would see on that application in Bulletin's Live 2 as an extension of the federal label. So if you if you input in Bulletins Live too, and it gives you additional restrictions, that is going to be considered part of the federal label, okay? Just to illustrate, this is what, if you would pull up the dicamba product labels from historically, if you read what's in that codes and limitation tables, that's where it tells you have to increase that downwind buffer and then add that 57-foot omnidirectional. There could be a whole myriad of different restrictions. There may be you cannot apply this product in this area at a certain time on the calendar, okay? So here's my questions that I still have. I'm not sure who's legally responsible for all this. If you own the ground, if you farm the ground, you make the applications, all on you. Anything other than that, I haven't got this figured out yet, especially the runoff mitigations. The buffers, spray drift, that's always on the applicator, okay? But I've asked this, if you look on the enlist label, and I know I'm bringing up a sore subject, at the top corner of that runoff mitigation table, it says applicator/landowner. And I have a hard time thinking how somebody who may be hired from a line IFS to show up and spray your field is supposed to be legally responsible for ensuring that you've got all the required runoff mitigation points. What % of Illinois farm ground is farmed by the person who owns the ground? 23%. 77% is not. What do you do when you have an absentee landlord? Remember Holly Spangler's story last fall? Who's the largest private owner of farm ground, absentee owner of farm ground in the state of Illinois? Mormon Church. University of Illinois owns 17,000 acres. Who's responsible? I don't know. Okay. What metrics will the agency use to determine how successful this is? Okay. Pesticides have not really caused the extinction of many species historically. I don't think we're going to start doing it now. That's a good thing, trust me. But how's EPA 5 years from now going to say, wow, is this being successful or not? What about if an NGO FOIAs the state lead agencies and wants the number of records of enforcement for ESA provisions and there aren't very many? What happens then? Okay. And then what other types of, how's the agency going to handle enforcement of this? If Illinois Department of Agriculture is called out because of a drift complaint, does US EPA expect them to go through all these other checks for ESA provisions? Okay. What type of record-keeping requirements are going to there be? I guess technically you do not have to track your mitigations if you don't want to, but if you get a point for doing that, it seems like a good thing to do. There's a lot of good resources. If you actually go to the Weed Science Society of America page, we've actually got a tab or a section there specifically on ESA resources. Bill Chisholm's done a great job of putting these things together. Actually, he put the slide set together. That's why I keep his name on the title slide of it. So with that, I will stop. I think we'll take questions toward the end, and I'm really looking forward to the next speaker. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brigit Rollins. I am a staff attorney with the National Agricultural Law Center, and we're going to go ahead and keep this conversation rolling, taking a closer look at the legal perspective specifically. And I think I'm waiting on my slides to come up. All right, I'm getting the, hold on a moment, finger. But hopefully, fantastic. Hopefully we'll be able to answer a couple of the questions that Aaron posed towards the end, maybe not fully, but kind of help give you all a better sense of sort of how this strategy, how this new policy came about, and sort of what the legal ins and outs are to be aware of. But first, I do want to start by just saying, if you have not heard of the National Agricultural Law Center before, hi, good morning. We have been around since the late 1980s, and we are the nation's leading source for agricultural and food law research and information. We are housed within the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture, and it's our job to provide neutral, nonpartisan resources on the current state of agricultural law to help you all understand, right, how the law is currently applying to you and how it's going to impact what you do day to day. So I am the environmental law person on staff, which means I get to have all the fun subjects like pesticides and water, but we have people on staff who tackle just about every area of the law as it pertains to ag. So if you are unfamiliar with our resources, our website is listed up on that slide there, and I encourage you to check it out and to reach out to us if there's anything that you feel we can do for you, because you are who we are here to serve. So on that note, I want to go ahead today and pivot a little bit, right? I want to talk to you all about the Endangered Species Act, what it says and what it doesn't say. I want to go ahead and talk about how the ESA really fits into this whole pesticide regulation situation, and then just share some final thoughts before we turn it over to questions. And I'm going to do my best to make sure we give you all a substantial time for questions, because I think this is one where, at least in my experience talking about this for the last year and a half or so, there's always quite a few questions. All right, so ESA basics, and this will be a little bit of a recap. However, always good to hear it more than once. The Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973 for the purpose of conserving threatened and endangered species and the ecosystems on which they depend. As Aaron said, right, it's not just about the species themselves, it's about the habitat, the ecosystems that those species rely on. And if we think about, the sort of overarching goal that Congress set in passing the ESA, that makes sense. It's all well and good to conserve a bald eagle, but if there's no habitat for that eagle, you got a lot of eagles and no place to put them. So it just sort of fits into the whole schema of this act. Again, the ESA is jointly administered by two different agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and it's those agencies that are responsible for identifying and listing species under the ESA and for designating critical habitat. And then once a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act, or once a particular area is designated as critical habitat, those areas receive certain ESA protections. And that's important because that's sort of why we're here today, fundamentally. We're going to talk about threatened and endangered species. For our purposes, it sort of doesn't matter the difference between the two. However, for anyone who is, just wondering what does that mean, an endangered species is a species that is considered to be in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And a threatened species is a species that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So, two different levels, but you'll find that when it comes to these protections, most of the time threatened and endangered species are treated the same. Now, when we're talking about adding a species to the Endangered Species Act, what are we talking about here? What does that entail? In general, a species can be listed in two different ways. The services can decide to list a species on their own initiative. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service can say, we've got enough data showing that this species should be listed. We're going to go ahead and start that process. But that's very rare. Most of the time a listing occurs, it's started by a petition submitted to the services by outside parties. And the law allows anyone, any individual, any organization to submit a petition to list a species. And then once that petition is submitted to Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries Service, they have an obligation under the Endangered Species Act to act on that petition and consider whether or not to list the species. So when making a listing decision, the Endangered Species Act lays out 5 factors that the services can consider, and any one of these factors can be sufficient to list a species. So the first factor that's there is the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of a species' habitat or range. And that's usually the factor that gets tapped the most often. That's usually the primary reason why a species is listed under the ESA, is because it's looking at a significant reduction of habitat and its range. And when we're talking about pesticides, I think Aaron did a great job of highlighting, right, it's about, there's not listed species really popping up in cornfields or soybean fields. The problem is the habitat that is adjacent to those fields. So when we're considering how many species are getting listed because of habitat reduction, you kind of start to see how the threads sort of weave together there. Other factors for listing include overutilization of the species, the presence of a disease or some sort of predation threat, maybe the inadequacy of current mechanisms to protect the species, and then sort of a final catch-all, any other man-made factors affecting the species' continued existence. But for the most part, the reason that we see species get added to the Endangered Species Act list, it's habitat reduction. Critical habitat, I'm not going to touch on too terribly much. It's important for you all to know what it is, because we're going to see that come in really in some of those PULAs that were talked about. But most of a species habitat is not going to be listed as critical habitat. I actually picked up a great new analogy yesterday from Craig McPeak with Fish and Wildlife Service for how I'm going to describe critical habitat to people. Critical habitat is the habitat that if you took it away from that species would cease to exist. So for example, if you have a particular frog that is found in only, 4 specific ponds, right? If those ponds are destroyed, that frog species would no longer exist. So when we're talking about areas that get designated as critical habitat, it's the habitat that specifically is needed to conserve the species. It's not necessarily the habitat that the species is fully occupying. So critical habitat is a legal term. It means that that area has been specifically designated by Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service as critical habitat. And again, that's not necessarily going to impact what you all do day to day as private actors on private lands. Where critical habitat really becomes important, those areas that have received that legal designation, is when we get to Section 7 consultation. And, we could talk about take, but I think that's a little beside the point. The real thing we need to focus on here, and why, we're sort of seeing this strategy policy from EPA, is because of Section 7 consultation under the ESA. So what is Section 7 consultation? Is that a term that anyone here has heard before? Is that fairly new? Who's heard of Section 7 consultation? Okay, a few hands, that's good. You'll all be able to say by the end of the day that you know what Section 7 consultation is. So this is really, in many ways, where the rubber meets the road with the Endangered Species Act. So while the Endangered Species Act is administered by 2 agencies, every single federal agency, like Aaron said, whether you're EPA or Department of Transportation or USDA, whatever you are, if you are a federal agency, you have responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act, and those responsibilities arise under Section 7 of the Act. So specifically, Section 7 requires all these federal agencies to ensure that any actions they take are not going to jeopardize listed species or destroy critical habitat. And there's a couple terms to unpack there. So first, an agency action, that is defined within the text of the Endangered Species Act, and it's defined very broadly as any action an agency has authorized, funded, or carried out. So that's not just something that the agency is doing itself. That's not just the Department of Transportation saying we're going to go in and revitalize a stretch of highway. If an agency is issuing a permit or providing funding, they have to do Section 7 consultation. Next, it's that term jeopardize, right? Jeopardize a listed species. That, again, is a legal term within the text of the Endangered Species Act, and it effectively means that the agency is going to ensure that its action will not contribute to the likely extinction of a listed species. Right? So if Department of Transportation is going to go in and revitalize, say, 50 miles of highway, they're going to have to ensure that doing that is not going to cause a listed species to go extinct, and also that doing that is not going to destroy any area that has been designated as critical habitat. And typically there, by destruction, the Act means modifying critical habitat in such a way that it can no longer be used as critical habitat for the species that it has been assigned to. So, all federal agencies have to do this, right? And it is I will tell you right now, it is a very time-intensive process, and for something like registering a pesticide product that is going to be used in all 50 states, it is even more intensive. The process is sort of twofold, and if I'm really good, I'll have my flow chart. Ooh, a flow chart. So Section 7 consultation begins with an agency action. If an agency is taking an action, they have triggered that need for Section 7 consultation. And the first thing the agency is going to do is do what's called informal consultation, where the agency is going to, kind of group up and figure out, does this action, is it likely to have no effect on a listed species, or may it affect a listed species? And that is a very low bar to clear to get to that may affect finding. Again, Erin, I think, did a really great job of pointing out, right? When we're talking about FIFRA versus the ESA is a very low threshold to clear. Is this action going to have no effect on species, or is it possible that some effects will be present? Very low bar to clear. So if the agency is very lucky and it's, let's say, again, it's the Department of Transportation, and they're revitalizing a 50-mile stretch and there are no endangered species within that 50-mile corridor, no effect. They're going to come to that no effect conclusion. And what they'll probably do then is reach out to Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service and just say, hey, do you guys agree with us that there's no effect? And if that service then says, yeah, we agree, we're done. End of the line. No need to go any further. Section 7 consultation is complete. However, if the Department of Transportation found, you know what, there are a handful of listed species within where we're planning to do this project, we think that there could be some effects to those species, they're going to go ahead and they're going to reach that may affect conclusion. And that is when they're going to have to do the next step of informal consultation. And this is where they're going to reach out to Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service, and they're going to do another kind of second step where they're going to ask, is this action likely to have adverse effects to listed species, or is it not likely to have adverse effects to listed species? If they find that it's not likely to have adverse effects, right? Maybe there will be some impacts, but they're not going to be negative. They're not likely to result in jeopardy or the destruction of critical habitat. Then there might be a little bit, the service will probably put together some document saying, hey, we think that this is not likely to have adverse effects, and the agency can continue as planned, and that would be the end of that particular Section 7 consultation. However, if the services conclude that this proposed agency action is likely to have adverse effects to listed species, right? It's likely to either result in jeopardy or result in destruction of critical habitat, then they have to go on and draft what is called a biological opinion, or you'll sometimes see this abbreviated as a BIOP. Sounds very medical. It is not. And this is a very complex document. This is when Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries Service is going to go through and they're going to draft a document that's looking at things like the base level of the species. What impacts is this proposed action likely to have? They might suggest mitigations or alternative actions to the agency. And then once that document is finalized, and this is a document that gets published in the Federal Register, so that means there's going to be a proposed final document and a period of public comment, and then a final document. So again, adding extra time. Then Section 7 consultation is complete, and the agency can choose how to proceed. So I don't usually like to, go all the way through Section 7 consultation because, my goodness, unless you're a lawyer or someone who works in this, it's a little bit of a slog. However, it's so critical to understanding why we're where we are today with this strategy. So this is the Section 7 consultation process. And again, if you were talking about an agency action that's in a fairly localized area that maybe only impacts one species, two species, this can still take several months to over a year. If you were talking about re-registering glyphosate, which is used, again, in all 50 states, there are over 1,000 listed species within the contiguous United States. This process can take a long time. ESA penalties I'm not necessarily going to go over because I think that it's not necessarily as critically important to understand for you all at this moment. I do, however, want to transition to talking about, right, how does this impact pesticides? So you all, right, this is probably not the first day, probably not the first time you've heard about this herbicide strategy, the insecticide strategy, but I will say this is announced as early as 2022. So it's been in the works for some time. You know, when we're kind of thinking about, is this going to go away? Important to remember the agency has been working on this for quite a long time. And essentially what the agency is trying to do, right, is to find a way to increase its compliance with the Endangered Species Act when taking actions under FIFRA, when taking those agency actions pursuant to FIFRA. The initial work plan that they released in 2022, if you go back to it, it does pretty much spell out exactly where we're finding ourselves now. That work plan announced that sort of what EPA was going to do is increase early mitigations that EPA is planning to develop to reduce those pesticide impacts to listed species. And I want to take a moment to linger on this term, early mitigations, because I think it's helpful to understand, you know, sort of what authority is EPA acting under here. Because when you look at the herbicide strategy, the insecticide strategy, that is not Section 7 consultation. That did not come out of Section 7 consultation. EPA is not taking this action. It's not drafting these strategies necessarily under its Endangered Species Act authority. It's drafting them under its FIFRA authority. And that's important because what EPA is trying to do is to say if we add these early mitigations, these mitigations on the front end, right, if we add these to the pesticide labels now, the hope is that when those labels eventually come up for Section 7 review, right, when EPA finally gets around to kind of doing that difficult work of conducting that 15-year registration review on pesticides, the goal is that when they then have to do Section 7 consultation on that re-registration, these early mitigations introduced by the strategies will mean that when a BIOP is developed, it will hopefully not include any additional mitigations, any additional suggestions from Fish and Wildlife or National Marine Fisheries Service to reduce impacts to species. So this is, in some ways, you could almost think of it as a little bit like a triage, right? The hope is that if they do these mitigations now by adding these to the labels on the front end, by the time those labels are reviewed under the Endangered Species Act by the services, that they're not going to be suggesting additional mitigations, that these will be enough to reduce impacts to species. So again, FIFRA, right? We're all familiar with FIFRA, that this is the law governing pesticide usage in the United States. It's administered by EPA, and before a pesticide can be sold or distributed in the United States, it has to be registered by EPA under FIFRA. And again, as Aaron said, these are two, you know, when you're comparing FIFRA to the ESA, two different statutes that operate differently, right? When EPA is registering a pesticide under FIFRA, they're conducting more of a balancing act. They're weighing the benefits versus the risks of using the pesticide. And if the benefits outweigh the environmental risks, EPA is going to register that pesticide. And very importantly, right, to this entire conversation, registering a pesticide is an agency action. And it's not the only agency action that EPA takes under FIFRA. EPA takes hundreds, if not thousands, of actions under FIFRA every year. They might modify an existing pesticide label to add a new use. They might register a new pesticide active ingredient. They might be doing re-registration of a pesticide, which in and of itself has many agency actions within it. They might be carrying out some other kind of review, and each of those actions could, in theory, require ESA consultation. And again, when you consider how many FIFRA actions EPA takes a year versus how long these Section 7 consultations can take, maybe we're starting to understand kind of the scope of the work that we're talking about here. And really importantly, to understand how do we get to this current moment, EPA has never been able to fully consult over its FIFRA actions, and this is the crux of the problem, right? Again, how many FIFRA actions a year? How big of a project area are they looking at? This is a monumental task. And, just kind of some general context, FIFRA was established before the Endangered Species Act. So when FIFRA was created, it really wasn't created with, it's sort of this Section 7 consultation requirement in mind. So you have these two acts that EPA has to comply with, and it's really struggled in the 50-some years since the Endangered Species Act was created. It's really struggled with how to sort of square that circle. And in recent years, and again about the last decade or so, this has resulted in a mounting lawsuits. EPA has been sued up one side and down the other. If you think you're having a bad day, try being an attorney for EPA, my goodness. But what we've seen with these lawsuits is every single time EPA loses, every single time. And why do they lose? Because courts have historically interpreted and enforced the Endangered Species Act to its fullest amount. This goes all the way back to Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill, which was the first Supreme Court case to come up to the court about the Endangered Species Act. And, it's a famous case. The sort of long and short of it is there was a dam that Congress had built in Tennessee that was going to supply electricity to communities in Tennessee that in the mid-70s still did not have electricity. This dam was, built with funds appropriated by Congress. It had been begun well before the passage of the Endangered Species Act, and it was all but complete in the early 1970s. The story sort of goes, they were basically just about to turn it on when they discovered an endangered fish, the snail darter, that was only found in this one location, and if the dam was turned on, it was going to cause jeopardy of the fish. It was going to cause the fish to go extinct. And the Supreme Court, they're looking at this issue, and they said, look, the way that the Endangered Species Act is written is so clear. Congress intended preservation of wildlife to come before all other concerns. So courts have always interpreted the Endangered Species Act very strictly. And what this means in the pesticide space and what this means for this strategy is that every single time EPA is sued by environmental groups saying, hey, EPA approved this pesticide and they didn't do ESA consultation. EPA modified this pesticide label. They didn't do ESA consultation. EPA re-registered this pesticide and they did not do ESA consultation. Every single time the court says, well, EPA, did you do Section 7 consultation? And EPA has not done Section 7 consultation, so they say, no, we have not, and the court says, okay, game over. So what we have seen is a sort of series of lawsuits that have ended in either a court order at best, sending the label back to the agency, but keeping it in place and telling the agency, okay, EPA, you need to do Section 7 consultation by this specific court-ordered deadline. And at worst, and this is, think sulfoxaflor here, if anyone found themselves sort of in the middle of that, I know that was some time ago, but at worst, the court is going to vacate the label. So that product will no longer be available. And really where we are now is a situation where between settlements, right, because a lot of the time the agency says, we know we're about to get smacked around by the court, why waste the money? Why not just settle? Between settlements and court orders, EPA says it's going to take it until about the mid-2030s to complete all of the Section 7 consultations that are under some kind of settlement agreement or court order. That is not including other consultations that are not subject to those kinds of orders. And I kind of think the mid-2030s might be a bit optimistic. So that is how we get to this new ESA FIFRA policy. And I'm trying to get a look at the time. I want to make sure I'm leaving you all time for questions. We're good? Okay. Aaron says we're good. So, right, like I said, this new policy is focusing on early mitigations, all those, all that point system stuff, all that spray drift stuff, that is all early mitigations that are going to be added to pesticide labels in the hopes of reducing impacts to listed species and critical habitat on this front end so that when these Section 7 consultations finally come up, instead of getting to a biop or a biological opinion where Fish and Wildlife Service is saying you need to introduce all these new mitigations to avoid violating the Endangered Species Act, instead, the goal is that the Section 7 consultation will conclude, okay, all of these new mitigations you've introduced as part of the herbicide strategy, as part of the insecticide strategy, they have done enough that we do not think that registering this pesticide is going to cause jeopardy or to a listed species or destroy critical habitat, and we can sort of keep going as is. So that is the goal. And more than just, hoping to sort of get to a point where these Section 7 consultations aren't going to result in any sudden surprise mitigations, the EPA is also trying to create pesticide labels that are going to stand up better in court, right? So that we're not going to be in a situation where these labels are vacated or where they're sent back to the ESA for further analysis that could then, again, be challenged in court. So this is sort of the legal landscape that has led us here. And I think it's important to understand that this is why we're here. Right? It's not that EPA has woken up and decided that they want to create some very complicated looking document. They are trying to sort of stem the tide of these lawsuits that have occurred as a result of about 50 years of the agency struggling to make these two different statutes come together. And again, something Aaron said, right? The Endangered Species Act is not likely to go away. There have been, over the years, different bills introduced in Congress attempting to modify the Endangered Species Act, but even those bills have not touched Section 7 consultation. And quite frankly, and I said this to a smaller group yesterday, if this Congress manages to pass anything more than maybe a budget, I will personally be shocked. I would not expect this to go away. So what are we looking at, right? Again, this is going to be a little bit of review. I think Aaron did a really great job walking through some of what we're seeing in the strategies themselves and how that's going to apply to the field. I would also encourage you, if you can, check out any of Dr. Stanley Culpepper's presentations on this. He's done a lot of great work on walking through, the practical application of these strategies, and he's done a lot of webinars that you should be able to find and access. But broadly, right, EPA is developing these mitigations in two different ways. So the first is these strategies, right? This herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, rodenticide, fungicide strategy, et cetera, where EPA is sort of grouping all herbicides, all insecticides, all rodenticides, all fungicides together, and then coming up with mitigations that are going to be applicable across the general use label. The other tactic they're taking is this more tailored approach, the Vulnerable Species Plan, the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, the VSAP, if you're like me and don't want to say all those syllables. This is the much more tailored approach where EPA is identifying species that it considers as particularly vulnerable to pesticide exposure and then drafting those PULAs, those pesticide use limitation areas, where any pesticide applied within those PULAs is probably going to have additional mitigations on top of the mitigations introduced by the herbicide, insecticide, rodenticide, and fungicide strategies. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time walking through some of this because I think Aaron did a really great job earlier, but the herbicide strategy, this is the first one of these to be finalized. Again, this is outlining those mitigations that EPA expects to include on all herbicide labels. And we're seeing these fall into the two categories that were described earlier, right? Reducing spray drift, reducing pesticide runoff, and erosion. Most of these are going to appear on the general pesticide label, either by directing users to go check out Bulletin's Life 2 or EPA's online mitigations calculator. That really is a very useful tool. I would encourage everyone in this room to check it out. It's nice to have, and I think it's going to be well worth your time to learn how to use. And then we are seeing, right, again, as discussed earlier, for the spray drift mitigations, we're looking at things like additional buffer requirements, additional windbreaks, hedgerows, equipment, requirements, right? Maybe some hooded sprayers, maybe application rate reductions, as we discussed earlier. It's going to be sort of a little bit up to you maybe, which you sort of choose to go with to meet the necessary mitigation level, but these are what we're seeing. And the good news here is these are all familiar. These are all things that you've probably seen before. Maybe the downside is that you're going to have to, you might need to do a little more than what you were doing before. And then again, for runoff and erosion, we're seeing that mitigation menu. We're seeing that we're going to have, and it's going to depend, right? Some pesticides might require as little as 1 point of runoff erosion mitigation, but up to perhaps 9 points to be able to apply that pesticide. And cannot stress enough, do check out that mitigation calculator. It's going to help you understand, some of those relief points, right? If you are in a particular county, you might have relief points. It's going to help you understand what practices that you are already doing that are going to count towards points. And you might be surprised. As Aaron said, fiddling around with it, you can sometimes pretty quickly get up to as much as 11 points. And that's great because you're only going to be asked to do up to 9. Dr. Culpepper has said pretty much the same thing. If you go through and start fiddling around, you might be surprised how quickly you can hit that mitigation point system or requirement, but do be aware that you might have to make some management changes. And again, there we're seeing EPA calls it its mitigation menu, where it is listing out various different activities that are going to have points attached. And the idea there is that every single field is different. You are going to have some flexibility in figuring out what works best for your situation, what works best for your fields. The draft insecticide strategy is pretty similar to the final herbicide strategy. Again, where these strategies are differing is fairly small. They tend to be more similar than not. So like the final herbicide strategy, the draft insecticide strategy is outlining those early mitigations that it's going to include on insecticide labels. The biggest difference is that the mitigations for the herbicide strategy are aimed at reducing pesticide exposure to threatened and endangered plant species, right? That makes sense. Herbicides target plants. The insecticide strategy is focusing on reducing exposure to invertebrates. And that's important because invertebrates are not necessarily all insects, right? There are plenty of aquatic invertebrates to be aware of as well. However, once again, we are seeing a focus on reducing spray drift, reducing runoff and erosion. We're seeing the use of Bulletins Live 2. And we're seeing, oh goodness, I went forward too quickly. But we're seeing, again, pretty much the same mitigations that we see in the herbicide strategy that are focused on reducing spray drift, that are focused on reducing runoff. They're about the same. We're seeing the point system and the mitigation menu come up again. So in theory, if you're sort of mastering that, if you're working on getting familiar with that for the herbicide strategy, it will be very similar for the insecticide strategy. The final thing I want to talk about is this Vulnerable Species Action Plan, or VSAP. This is the more tailored approach. This is where we're seeing those PULAs come up. And this is going to function slightly differently than the herbicide strategy and the insecticide strategy because these are geographically tailored restrictions. So when you are using a pesticide that has instructions on there to go and check out Bulletins Live 2, to be in compliance with the label, you need to go check out Bulletins Live 2 and see, is there an active PULA in the area that you are intending to apply that pesticide? And I'll let you know right now, those PULAs, these are also kind of, you'll notice a theme, getting split into 2 kinds of categories. These are being called avoidance PULAs and minimization PULAs. So minimization PULAs are going to be where you are seeing increased mitigation requirements. So maybe on top of everything else you're doing to be in compliant with the herbicide strategy, you also have to do some additional mitigation if you are applying within a minimization PULA. An avoidance PULA could be an area where you are not able to apply or that you have to get permission from Fish and Wildlife Service to apply. I personally still have a lot of questions about this. The EPA has sort of not fully really fleshed out how they expect folks working within minimization or avoidance PULAs to operate, but be aware, this is going to be, you might be seeing some of this. and relying, being sure that you check out Bulletins Live 2 to understand, what's in your area is going to be helpful. Now, we just saw that map of Illinois on Bulletins Live 2. No PULAs in Illinois. Huzzah. But for, that is for this year. That could be different next year. So make sure that you are staying on top of that, right? Being aware, having that information is going to give you a leg up. And again, the VSAP mitigations, I will say they're not surprising. They're sort of the same thing we're seeing. Spray drift buffers, prohibition of certain application methods to reduce spray drift. For runoff and erosion, fortunately, we're not seeing the point menu here. I think that's nice because that would have been, I think, fairly untenable to have a point system on top of a point system. But we might see mitigations such as no applications when the soil is saturated, no applications when rain is in the forecast. But again, you can see how that's going to be fairly tricky maybe to implement, because how often are you fully aware of whether or not it's actually going to rain? If your weatherman is anything like my weatherman, sometimes he's right and sometimes he is not. So you kind of see this could be tricky. So next steps, what is coming down the pike? EPA plans to issue a final insecticide strategy this year. I think they have a deadline for sometime in the summer. They are going to continue to develop bulletins for the 27 species that are currently listed under that Vulnerable Species Action Plan, but be aware, they can add more, and they, as far as I know, intend to add more. So there's 27 species now, there could be more this time next year. And then we are expecting to see the herbicide strategy start appearing on labels this year. I believe Alexandra Dunn from CropLife America gave an interview at the end of last year where she said that probably we're going to see this come up on 4 or 5 labels this year. And that's important. Erin noted that these strategies are not self-implementing. EPA is going to start applying these strategies when they are registering new pesticide products or conducting registration reviews of existing products. So it's not going to be all at once. You're not going to wake up and suddenly every single label on every product that you use has these mitigations. There's going to be a little bit of a ramp up time, which I always think is a good thing. It gives people more time to fully kind of get their arms around a situation, but that ramp is starting this year. And then kind of importantly, when we're thinking about these next steps, Erin mentioned a mega suit, okay? All of these deadlines are part of the settlement of that mega suit that was filed in 2014. So it's been just over a decade. And this was a lawsuit brought by a coalition of environmental groups challenging thousands, hundreds at least, over 1,000, a lot of pesticide labels for EPA's failure to do Section 7 consultation. So part of EPA settling that suit, and again, opening this thing up means putting all of those labels in front of a court. And again, like we talked about earlier, courts interpret the Endangered Species Act very strictly. Putting them in front of a court could be very, that is a real gamble. There is a reason why EPA settled this suit. However, that means that all of these deadlines for implementing this policy is part of a court settlement agreement, which means that if EPA does not meet these deadlines, does not meet its side of the settlement agreement, the plaintiffs can go to the court and say, hey, EPA is not doing this settlement agreement, and they can get the court to move in and enforce it. Or they can open the entire case back up. So it is certainly I think EPA believes it's in its best interest to continue implementing this strategy, this policy, and from how we've seen courts treat these lawsuits, it's most likely in the best interest of people who rely on these products that EPA, at least does its level best to comply with the settlement agreement. And then a couple of things to keep in mind, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it. We're all aware there's some shakeups going on at the federal level right now. It's really not clear yet how potential staffing shortages are going to impact EPA, but I can say that if there are significant staffing shortages at EPA, that is going to very likely push out the timeline for when these strategies can be completed, which, getting back to that settlement agreement, if those timelines are pushed out beyond what is agreed to in the settlement, that could potentially raise some issues with the plaintiffs in this case and the courts. So again, I can't really tell you what is going to happen there. It's more questions than answers right now, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we could see some disruption there. But right now it's unclear. We could see no disruption and it could all be fine, but just wanted to make sure that you are all aware of that. So just some final thoughts, and then I think we should have some time here for questions. Right, this policy is still under construction. The comment period on the draft insecticide strategy has closed, but there is going to be a fungicide strategy in the next year or so here, and there will be time to submit comments on that. And as Aaron said, right, please submit comments. They want to hear from you. They want your input, and you want them to have your input, right? These are strategies being developed by, staffers at EPA who are very knowledgeable, but they don't have the same kind of practical on-field experience that you all do. So when there is more opportunity to do public comment, be sure that you're doing some public comment. Again, as a reminder, this is the year that we're going to start to see some of these herbicide strategy mitigations come up on existing labels. Pay attention, be aware, and start to get familiar with some of these tools, right? Be prepared on the front end so that you're not sort of caught blindsided later on. And then finally, there is some uncertainty right now about what might happen if EPA is not able to meet its deadlines. That's all kind of unclear at the moment. It's very possible that it will not be an issue at all, but I think it's something to just be aware of as we sort of move through getting this strategy up off the ground. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to put my contact information up here. You can reach out to me at any time, and I will do my best to help you in any way I can. And I think with that, I don't know, do you want to come back up? We'll do a two-person Q&A. You can help with any of the practical stuff, yeah.
I have a question for each of you. First question is, in light of what just happened in California, does an endangered species take precedence over human life and property? That's my first question. And then for Aaron, where would we find the list for our county of endangered species?
Oh, that's a good one. I will go first. Let's tackle the hard one first. It's tricky. I'm going to say yes and no. The way the Endangered Species Act is written and the way courts have interpreted it, wildlife preservation is considered fairly paramount. However, there is room within the Endangered Species Act for exceptions to be made if, for example, you have a giant dam that's about to bring electricity to communities that are rural and do not have that. Clearly having electricity, even if it means perhaps flooding an area where there is a fish, like that's something to be taken very seriously. So there was actually an intervention and an act by Congress that allowed the dam to be turned on and completed in California. And I assume you're referring to the wildfires? Yes. Subject that's near and dear to my heart. My hometown in California was hit by wildfires in 2017. So this is something I'm very, this is close to home for me. And what we've seen already is some action on the federal and the state level to waive some of those Endangered Species Act requirements. So the answer there is it's a balance. Like most policies, like most regulations, this is a balance. The way the Endangered Species Act is written does give a lot of weight towards the preservation of wildlife. There is also wiggle room for understanding that sometimes there is something that you are addressing that means that you need to move quickly and not necessarily be caught up in red tape. Now, do I think that's necessarily going to end up applying in some of this pesticide stuff? I don't see that happening anytime soon.
I know we can find the maps at least to the state level resolution, but I'm not sure if we can actually get down to a county level. I'd have to look into that for you. to be sure. But we can find, there's an easy website that we can go to list at least by state, but I'm not sure if we can get down to county or not.
And I would add to that, something that we are seeing from EPA as they're developing these policies, and especially the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, they are working with maps that are developed by Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's not surprising, right? Fish and Wildlife Service is listing most of our terrestrial species. They're in charge of putting together maps of where those species are located. However, mapping where a species is located can be difficult and time-consuming and resource-consuming. Oftentimes, the best maps that Fish and Wildlife Service has, which then means the best maps that EPA has, are just a description of the habitat that that species is known to be found in. So one of the things that EPA has been requesting from the public is any help, any data to help them better refine those maps, to help them figure out where are these species actually located so that we can craft PULAs and craft mitigations that are going to be better targeted. So again, if that's something that you feel called to help with, EPA is happy to take as much data as they can get. The better the maps, the more refined these are going to be.
If you've got in your county, you've got 3 endangered species, and they are in maybe 5% of the county area, does the whole county have to engage in this mitigation strategy?
I'm pretty sure the mitigations have to be followed because that's part of the label now, right? So you have to follow the label. If it says you have to do, the spray drift buffer and the runoff mitigations, you have to do those. The PULAs, I think, would more likely address any additional restrictions that you might have to do, because when you go to Bulletin's Live 2, you put in the pesticide registration number and the time of year you're going to make that application. So there, as we mentioned earlier, there could be times where there could be no applications because maybe there's a plant species that happens to flower in this narrow window or something along that line, for example. But, if it's on the label, basically that's something that you have to follow regardless of what species are in the county.
But are the PULAs likely to be more geographically limited?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have to look at Bulletin's Live 2 within 6 months of when you make that application.
Yes.
Because they do change. And a good example that I can give you is that when we had, the first time we had to use Bulletin's Live 2 for the dicamba soybean products, we went through there, we highlighted all the counties. 2 years later, on a whim, I just thought I would check it again. It had changed significantly. We had 27 counties initially listed there, but the next time I looked at it, it was 18. And that meant that there were like 11 that were previously listed that were no longer listed, but there were 5 that were not previously listed that now were listed. So they do change.
Yep, I'm going to completely echo that. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but the label is the law. So if you are applying a pesticide and it is saying, pursuant to the herbicide strategy, you have to do X, Y, and Z things, that is going to be what you have to do regardless of whether, you know for a fact that there's an endangered species located near your operation or not. The PULAs, however, those are going to be geographically limited, and yes, you are going to be instructed to check 6 months before the application, and they do change, and they will change. I can say in Arkansas, which is where I live, a couple years ago, there was a bit of a brouhaha because when the Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo labels came out, they were going to be restricted for use in several counties in Arkansas because the American burying beetle, which is a listed species, was thought to be found there. Fortunately, our Division of Ag was able to kind of get together, and our research scientists were able to show that the American burying beetle was not actually present in those counties, which meant that that PULA shifted. So, make sure you're checking, make sure you're staying on top of this.
I have 2 questions. The first one being, we've heard a lot in the last 2 days about being in competition with Brazil and South America. Do they have the same regulations hindering them that we potentially will if a lot of these come about that would further put us behind them? The second one, how do we control invasive weeds in all of these buffer areas that to not create a potential bigger problem for weeds that we need more chemicals and more chemistry to try and solve later on?
I can tackle the first question. And so I'm not an expert in international law. I'm not an expert in Brazil's wildlife laws. But as far as I know, they don't have anything that looks quite like the Endangered Species Act, right? And that makes sense. They're a different country. They have a different legal system. They are doing their own thing. So as far as I know, they don't have anything that looks quite like this. I don't know if you have some answers for the second one.
We can try.
Yeah.
I mean, all this restriction is based on pesticide use, right? But if you had an area that you cannot treat, there's other alternatives that you could do in that area, right? You just could not make that application in that buffer zone. I get what you're getting at, right? Because you don't really want to leave 50 feet of untreated, especially if you got a 2-year lease agreement on that farm and absentee landlord comes through about middle of the season. But that's how it is. Or there could be, you could look at possibly alternative products that don't have as wide of a downwind buffer, for example. Or you could modify, take some of those practices that are on that table in the drift portion of the strategy and implement those so you don't have a buffer, basically.
Okay, one follow-up question. If these are implemented and we have to do them and growers do, we've seen that with a lot of the vacated labels and things, what it's done, I think in the industry, grower-wise, is just kind of turned everybody rogue, saying, there's so much we can't follow, we're just going to do whatever we want. Is that a potential problem, or who or how is this going to be policed? Is it going to stop at the company level? Is it going to go to the retail level? Is it going to go to the grower level? And is there enough people to police all of this?
Yeah, I think those are two really important questions. And right now, I think some of it's a little unclear. Off-label, just throwing things around up here. Off-label usage is probably going to be treated the way that it has always been treated, right? Where you have the state agencies doing their investigations. And again, the label is the law, so they are going to be looking at that. How that plays out state by state, is probably going to vary depending on what your state does, how much resources they have for that. Something I will say to be aware of, I don't know how much this has crossed anyone's kind of attention in this room, but Bayer, with all the ups and downs with dicamba, has started to suggest that they are not pleased with off-label usage, and that we have seen actually, in at least one instance, Bayer initiate litigation against a farmer for alleged off-label use, right? So we could potentially, the companies have a vested interest in this, right? These are products they are developing and marketing, and at the end of the day, they are looking to, right, recoup their costs, make a profit, please their shareholders. So for them, if they're starting to see their products maybe threatened in the court system and off-label usage being a problem, we've just sort of started to see Bayer kind of explore this, and it makes sense that it would be Bayer that is kind of leading the charge here. Sorry to anyone in this room who maybe works for Bayer. I know you guys have really been going through it the last decade or so. But I think that right now it's really, we know, we have more questions than answers, I think. And I think that it's less, I can't necessarily tell you this is exactly what's going to happen, but those are the pieces that I think should be kept in mind, right? We're probably going to see these are probably going to be treated like off-label uses, the way that we have seen off-label uses treated in the past. Probably enforcement is going to vary from state to state. The question of whether they're going to have enough manpower to police some of this, I think, is also going to vary from state to state. And for the companies, it is possible that we could start to see the companies go after off-label usage more than they traditionally have.
Question. As they finalize the insecticide strategy, what implications for, say, planting treated seed would there be in that strategy?
So as they finalize the insecticide strategy, I'm trying to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking sort of, is that going to have an impact to?
Yeah, will it be mitigation efforts for planting treated seed? Say you're in a PULA for insecticide, is that going to have an implication for planting treated seed or anything like that?
Treated seed. I was hearing trees and seed.
Treated seed.
No, you are so fine. That is a great question. EPA does not regulate treated seeds as individual pesticides. This was, in fact, something that they announced as recently as last year. So EPA does not regulate treated seeds as pesticides. They regulate the pesticide, and if the pesticide is allowed to be kind of used for treated seeds, and we see this mostly with neonicotinoids, then, they're going to register and do all their stuff with the pesticide, but they're not going to treat the treated seed itself as a pesticide product. Now, again, we are starting to see in some state legislatures some efforts to regulate treated seeds. I've not seen anything like that in Illinois, but be aware, New York is looking at that, California is looking at that, and you guys know Illinois does take a look at what California and New York does. So I wouldn't expect to see that necessarily from the federal level or necessarily have that much of an impact from these strategies, but you might somewhere down the line see some state stuff there, but that will be different than this. And I don't know if you, yeah.
Mine's a little backwards. It doesn't have to do with herbicide, but you got the Endangered Species Act, and they have to follow, they find out what's endangered. Does the federal government and state governments have to look at introducing wildlife that can damage crops and farmers? Because you hear the wolves out west, and then they eat the ranchers' calves. In Illinois, they reintroduced turkeys, and they moved out of those state parks, and now all the farms along these streams that they came out are doing damage. As a lawyer in ag, is there any way to stop there? Or do they look at what damage that's going to do before they release these? Because it seems like they keep introducing things in parks that cause damage to farmers, livestock, and crops.
There's a couple different things there. So the Endangered Species Act requires whenever a species is listed, the goal is to get that species off the endangered species list. There's two ways a species can be delisted. It's delisted because it goes extinct, or it's delisted because it is recovered. And obviously, the goal of the act is towards recovery, not extinction. So when a species is listed under the ESA, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, they are required to create recovery plans. And I will say, bless their hearts, they are never going to have enough resources to create successful recovery plans for every species on that list. Some of the ones that you're going to see get more attention are going to be your wolves, your turkeys, your things that get people energized. Now, in Colorado, it's a little different because they've got a lot of public lands, so that is what they are focused on managing. Some of those recovery projects do include reintroduction of species. We've seen it with wolves, with grizzly bears, with some turkeys, and they are required to do some balancing. And there has been some attempt to push back, particularly the wolf recovery and reintroduction plans in Colorado. We've seen some litigation there. But again, the way the Endangered Species Act is written and the way courts tend to implement it, I have not seen any success there from folks sort of seeking that avenue to curtail introduction. That's not to say that we might not see, we could see something in the future, but this is still somewhat of an emerging field. So the answer is there's really not a great avenue as of yet. That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? No, it's okay. It's honestly, so he's asking, we're all aware, right? We're all reading the news. RFK Jr. is the nomination for HHS. He has some fairly out-of-the-box views on pesticide use in agriculture. And the question is, what are we potentially expecting to see if he gets confirmed? And I wish I had a better answer for you than I don't really know. And
I appreciate your honesty.
I wish I had a better answer. It's tricky because HHS, in theory, does not participate in pesticide regulation. That is the purview of EPA. However, I think that it's probably fair to say that RFK Jr. is expected to have a significant amount of influence. I think right now it's really up in the air what that influence is going to look like and whether or not, he is able to take any actions within his specific role as Secretary of HHS. I wish I had a better answer for you than that. I really do, because this is something that, as an attorney working in this space, I'm looking at and going, I wish I had a better answer. But I think right now it's really up in the air. And
Well, usually my answer to a question like that, if regulatory decisions are based on science, we're fine. It's when the politics gets involved in that. And that's where I'm not a very good politician. Most of you know I'd probably tell you what I think. But anyway, so that's the concern I always have. I mean, the science I think is very solid, but a lot of times politics will trump the science.
And I'm going to say, yeah, exactly that. And that's part of why it's so difficult to predict right now what, if any, impact he's going to have.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I think we're at time. So thank you all so much. It has been lovely to speak to you today. Again, my contact information is up there. Reach out to me if there's anything I can do to help you, or if there's a question that you have that didn't get answered today. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Well, I know that both of our speakers have probably a lot more to say on the topic, as I know Corey on our team has a lot more to say too, and has been doing workshops around the state over